Hey class, welcome back. We are getting started today on the Great Depression. We went through the 20s, then we went back to World War One, and now we're going back to where we left off at the stock market crash and the Great Depression. We're going to talk a little bit, a few things that went on in the Great Depression today with the overview. And the Great Depression was a time of poverty. Everybody lost their money with the stock market crash, and the people lost jobs, they lost their homes, they lost cars, they lost everything they owned. Just about. There was only a few that didn't, and that's what we're talking about today: the Great Depression. It was a time of great economic crisis during the 1930s. It began in the United States, but quickly spread throughout a lot of the world. During this time, many people were out of work, they were hungry, they were homeless. In the city, people would stand in long lines at soup kitchens just to get a bite of food. And in the country, farmers struggled. In the Midwest, there was just drought. All right, there was no rain at all, and it turned the soil to dust. All right, and it caused these big dust storms all over the Midwest. So that's what the Great Depression was. Like I said, it was a time of where people were out of work, where they were hungry, where they were homeless.
What was it? The Great Depression was a time of great economic crisis during the 1930s. It began in the United States but quickly spread throughout much of the world. During this time, many people were out of work, hungry, and homeless. In the city, people would stand in long lines at soup kitchens to get a bite to eat. In the country, farmers struggled in the Midwest where a great drought turned the soil into dust, causing huge dust storms.
So how did the Great Depression start? Well, the Great Depression started, we learned, but when we talked about the roaring 20s, the stock market crashed. When the stock market crashed in October 1929, that's when historians generally say, hey, that was the start of the Great Depression. All right, it's including drought, overproduction of goods, bank failures, stock speculation, and consumer debt. All these things played a part in the Great Depression, but it really began with the crash of the stock market in October 1929.
How did it start? The Great Depression began with the crash of the stock market in October of 1929. Historians and economists give various causes for the Great Depression, including drought, overproduction of goods, bank failures, stock speculation, and consumer debt.
All right, change of president. Herbert Hoover, this guy right here, he was the president at the start of the Great Depression. All right, President Roosevelt, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, eventually took over about 4 years later. Many people blamed Hoover for the Great Depression. They even named these shanty towns, these little towns where they put together with cardboard boxes and stuff for homeless people. They named them after him, and they called them Hoovervilles. And in 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt, he was elected president, and he promised the people a new deal when he was elected president. Right here's one of these shanty towns where the houses were made of a little bit of wood, cardboard, tar paper, and whatever they could find because they were homeless.
Change of presidents. Herbert Hoover was president of the United States when the Great Depression began. Many people blamed Hoover for the Great Depression. They even named the shanty towns where homeless people lived Hoovervilles after him. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president. He promised the people of America a new deal.
All right, the New Deal. The New Deal was a series of laws, programs, government agencies that were put in progress to help the country deal with the Great Depression. All right, they placed regulations on stock market, banks, and businesses, and they helped put people to work and tried to help house and feed the country or the poor. And many of these laws are still in place today, like the Social Security Act. So all these were different things that Franklin D. Roosevelt put in place when he became president.
The New Deal. The New Deal was a series of laws, programs, and government agencies enacted to help the country deal with the Great Depression. These laws placed regulations on the stock market, banks, and businesses. They helped put people to work and tried to help house and feed the poor. Many of these laws are still in place today, like the Social Security Act.
All right, so how did the Great Depression end? Well, it ended with the start of World War II. World War II took place, it came about 1939 when it started. And the wartime economy, it put people back to work, it filled factories to capacity. And this is generally, it lasted about 10 years, 1929, 1939 is when the Great Depression, but when everything started changing when World War II came about.
How did it end? The Great Depression ended with the start of World War II. The wartime economy put many people back to work and filled factories to capacity.
All right, so the legacy of the Great Depression. The Great Depression, it left this lasting legacy on the United States. It's still talked about today because that's how bad it was at this time. The New Deal laws, they increased the role of government in people's everyday lives. All right, like they started playing more of a part in these. All right, they had these public works that were built up. They built up the infrastructure of the country. All right, they had construction of roads, schools, bridges, parks, airports. All these are still around today because of stuff that was put in place during the Great Depression.
Legacy. The Great Depression left a lasting legacy on the United States. The New Deal laws significantly increased the role of the government in people's everyday lives. Also, public works built up the infrastructure of the country with the construction of roads, schools, bridges, parks, and airports.
All right, comprehension question. What event is generally considered to be the start of the Great Depression? It was at the end of the Roaring '20s that we talked about. Was it A, Prohibition, B, the stock market crash, or C, the Dust Bowl? It was B, the stock market crash. When the stock market crashed, everybody lost their money. They started losing their jobs. Factories were put out of business. Banks were put under. So all these things took place. It was the stock market crash.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number two, who was president of the United States at the start of the Great Depression? Was it A, Franklin D. Roosevelt, B, Woodrow Wilson, or C, Herbert Hoover? Herbert Hoover was the president of the United States at the start of the Great Depression, and many people blamed him, even though he really didn't have a whole lot to do with it. Now, he didn't help a whole bunch of people out, but at the same time, and he didn't want government to get too involved in everything. But they blamed him. He didn't really have a whole lot to do with it, but they blamed him.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number three, what were the shanty towns where many homeless lived called during the Great Depression? Was it A, Hoovervilles, B, cardboard cities, or C, nothing? It was A, Hoovervilles. They were named after President Herbert Hoover because a lot of people blamed him for the Great Depression.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number four, what event brought an end to the Great Depression? A, the Civil War, B, World War II, or C, the American Revolution? That would be B, World War II. When World War II came about, just 20 years after the end of World War I, 21 years, it came about, and the economy went back up because of everything, and people went back to work. They had factories that were producing goods again. So, and people needed work for that.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Wartime economy. And number five, what was the New Deal? A, it was laws and programs to help end the Great Depression. B, a radio show put on by the president, or C, nothing? It was A, laws and programs that were designed to help end the Great Depression.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
And that's our last one. And we'll come back next time with the Great Depression. Still, we're going to be talking more in depth about the causes of the Great Depression. And I will see you all next time. You all have a very good day. All right, bye-bye.